We have some provisions now with the Congressional Budget Office for doing some different kinds of analysis than they've done before. And I think it would be quite possible for them to take a look at a regulation and say how much it's going to cost. I don't think they'd be able to take a look at it and see what the benefit would be. They're not into benefit analysis, but they could tell us what the cost of it will be, not just the outright cost, but also the cost of the economy of it. They'll be evaluating that sort of thing. So,
is there ever a check that comes back when CBO gives us an estimate of what they assume it's going to cost to put a program in? Is there ever a retrospective look to find out later how much it actually cost? Because CBO often gives us an estimate to say this is going to be $50 million. Do we ever go back 5 years later and say, was it really 50 million, or was it 40, or was it 150 million?
not on something as small as 50 million.
How about if it was $1 billion? Yeah. Now we're talking real money.
Yeah, $1 billion is there's usually a look back on that, and of course, it's easier if you're predicting about the past instead of the future, which they have to do when they start. But
well, some of it's just the accountability for the estimates that CBO provides us, because we're very dependent on the CBO estimates. But I don't know how often we go back and take a look back, especially on a regulatory issue, and say, did it line up with what we thought it was going to actually cost?
I'd like to ask a question then. I know that North Carolina sets a 10-year limit on any regulation. It sunsets, they sunset all of their regulations. Wyoming sunsets pretty much all of their regulations. We don't do it at a set time. We try to evaluate it a little bit more on, you know, what the impact and how much we know about the regulation. But 10 years would be a way out thing. What do you think about having a sunset on every regulation before it has to be reenacted?
My own view is that the right way to do this would be to institutionalize the retrospective review, and then if the review came back with different benefits or different costs than had been estimated prospectively, that there would be a requirement for a new rulemaking, which would have the choice of sunsetting it or repealing it or modifying it or you know, whatever was appropriate. And a key would be to put in a trigger so that was actually followed through on. And, you know, you guys are much more expert at that than I am.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, we have a procedure now where if the regulation is going to affect small business to $100 million, it has to come before a special committee. But not many ever go to that committee anyway. I'd go back to maybe a bit more basic question. Should regulations all be assigned on legislative assignment? You know, the agencies have the right to just go out and do something they think is important, or should they have to run it through a legislative process or approval of some kind before they can do it?
So that might get back to Senator Round's idea of having a committee in Congress that reviews the regulations. I've actually written about that, and I'm happy to share some of that. I think it's intriguing, and I think it could impose needed discipline, not only on the agencies, but on Congress, too.
Right.
But I think it could. You might run into other issues, and I think it has real
if you've got a
potential.
paper on it, I'd be interested in seeing that.
Senator Langford, can I just
Company anytime.
Okay, I'll go a slightly different, but I think we've been this way a little bit, but in Colorado recently, there's a company that's been mining coal for 8 years under a permit that was approved. Now their permit is being challenged under a regulation that doesn't really exist, and that's to see if there is regulatory impact where the coal is used rather than under where it's mined, which is what the regulations actually go into. How much latitude should an agency have on bringing in outside groups to reinterpret rules later? Not that that question was suggestive at all.
Yeah,
I'm kind of appalled at it because they picked on a really small company first, But if it works on that company, it could shut down coal across the whole United States while an evaluation is done on what their customers use the coal for and how much impact that it has. And that seems to me to be a pretty far reach on a regulation that's been written.
And that's related to the interpretive, it's a new well, it's related to both that and permitting. I'm not familiar with it either,
Yeah.
but it's interesting.
I'm not sure where the jurisdiction for it comes.
It could dramatically change it whether it's going domestic, international as well. If you're going to actually ship that coal to somewhere else, would they say, well, that plant is not as good as an American plant, so until it reaches our standards, then you can't actually mine it here or sell to that person. It changes everything. So it's pretty dramatic, not just for usage of coal in the United States, but internationally.
Yeah, they only have to meet a regulation now that they will reclaim and not pollute while they're doing it, but they have to reclaim to the same standard that it was before they started. So this is an additional regulation, interpretation, something that they put in there that now they've got to evaluate after 8 years what the impact is where the coal's actually burned. And that's never been a part of the process.
Having been surprised they didn't already have that in those two notebooks.
Sounds like a pretty thin application to me. Most of our mines require about 8 foot of documentation in order to do it, and it not only concerns the land where the mine is, but they have to analyze their impacts of any communities that would be impacted too, and suggest what sorts of things they might do to mitigate that. So it's a very extensive process to be able to get a permit in the first place, which might be 7 or 8 years long, and then to have it reinterpreted after you've made the capital expenditure already to do what you promised to begin with, to have it reviewed again.